Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Cricket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
The very first time I heard the phrase, the Betwixt and the Between, I think was when I very first started my journey into shamanism. And my teacher at the time was learning Welsh. His family was from Wales, and he referred to this place in between space, the Betwixt and the Between. I have since read this term in books, various books, and I have also come across the term betwixt and between, referred to as that space between the wick and the flame. So I like the words betwixt and between. I think they sound kind of funky. But have we ever talked about them? Do we know about them? Do we know that they live in our world? Do we know that the betwixt and the between are talked about extensively in our stories, our myths, and our fairy tales, period? It's often referred to as the wilderness, or that place that between that which is known and that which is unknown. I find the question of who or what determines what is natural and what is wild to be something quite fascinating to ponder. It certainly doesn't mean that I have an answer, but it is interesting to ponder. There are various relationships to the forest or to the woods that we see in many different stories, or different ways that culture, a country has preserved their forests. If you have a relationship of fear with forests, I believe that countries were more easily taken down of trees or had less relationship to, say, parks or natural preserves. I think countries that have a good relationship with wild and natural spaces and good relationship with the unknown would have far more trees than, say, a country just as what I was describing. I'll give you an example. In Germany, there are approximately 35% of the land is still trees. And in their myths and in their stories, they have generally good relationships with trees, or good relationship with the wildness and the wilderness. As opposed to Europe, which has 11 to 15% of its land mass being in trees. And if we look at some of the stories such as Hansel and Gretel, or if we look at Little Red Riding Hood, which came out of France, we can see that the relationship to the trees and to wilderness has shifted the relationship to the forest and to the wildness. If I stand back from my completely untested hypothesis and view it from the perspective of relationship to the soul, relationship to the seeker's soul, and relationship to the great unknown, then I would postulate that those with a wilder spirit, or a spirit not so confined to structures and rules of religious dogma or religious structure, may also have a greater relationship to the wilderness and to the wildness. I cannot speak for Germany by any stretch of the imagination. However, I do know what the church and the confines of the church, the structure of the church, not God or the spirit of church, but the structure of the church, how it had imposed its view, its ever-changing view, imposed its view of wildness as being not sacred. So that's all I'm going to say about that, but I'm going to continue on with the betwixt and the between. I really like Handsome Lake. He was a Seneca chief, and he said that the world between this world and that world, I apologize, I got ahead of myself. What he said was the space between this world and the spirit world is the width of a maple leaf. And because I'm Canadian and because we have the maple leaf on our flag, that one has always kind of spoken to me. It is true that there is that liminal place, that space between what is mundane and what is sacred. Where is that divisible line? I asked earlier what makes something natural and what makes something wild. In myths and stories from Greece, from Rome, even from the Gauls, who then became the Celts, there is this unspoken, unknown place where you have unwittingly, unknowingly, perhaps knowingly stepped off the world of civilization and into the world of the mysterious. And one of some of the stories are if you witness the goddess Athena in all of her glory, she in naked swimming, she turns a poor hunter into a stag, and as a result he was out hunting, and as a result he cried out like a stag in the throes and the agony of him losing his life, and his group of dogs set upon him, cornered the stag, and slaughtered their master. So the story of that is that we always have to be careful. Where is this place between the world of the mundane and the world of the sacred? There are also myths and stories which refer to fairies, and you can go this one step, that one step, and maybe even take a fairy path, and the next thing you know, you've stepped into the world of the Fae. And some of the, the Central European stories of the Fae and the Celtic people, and some of the other people who still have an engagement with the Fae folk, and the myth or the idea that you can step into the fairy world, and if you're gone for a day, then you're gone for 3 years. If you're gone for 3 days, then you're gone for 300 years. And the overwhelming message, I suppose, that I get from that is when you enter into the sacred, you cannot come back out and not be changed. The story of the 1 day and 3 years, 3 days, 300 years really bespeaks to, I think, our stories telling us that if we dance with the sacred, we will come back changed. And I think it is also the story of some of the superstitions and the fears that if we travel beyond that which is unknown, then when we come back, we won't have, we won't be the same. Therefore, you won't fit in. You won't be part of the norm. You won't have a relationship with normal, with the community. So there are two parts to that. The first part is the type of culture, the type of people who encourage you to go beyond the betwixt and the between, to enter the betwixt and the between, enter into the sacred world and see how you are once you move past the sacred world. And then there are those who are afraid of the wilderness, who are afraid of stepping past the boundaries of known or unknown, and what is known or unknown. And therefore, if you go there, you will change. And if you change, therefore, I cannot accept you. And if I cannot accept you, then why would you go? Because isn't my opinion, hence the overculture, not just an individual, isn't my opinion of you more important than your desire to be who you wish to be? So that's an aspect also of the betwixt and the between, how it has continually changed and morphed within our society and morphed within our culture to be exactly what it is a warning to where the danger zone is. It is that liminal place. It is that place that is uninhabited by human beings, where the natural and the free. So the wilderness is filled with what we fear in ourselves and also what we fear in society. Wilderness in the stories is where we expel all of that stuff, the things we don't like in ourselves, in our culture, in our society, what we see as dangerous or disordered. So this is some place that is of us and yet not of us, what is near to us and what is far away. Again, I want to go back to the analogy that the space between this world and that world is as thin as a maple leaf. I want to incorporate that the betwixt and the between is that liminal place. When I talk about journeying and when I talk about the threshold, and when I talk about the gatekeeper and moving through the gatekeeper, this is that place, that betwixt and the between. This is that place where it is not here and it is not there. It is that space of, I think perhaps the word that I would use, and you don't have to use this word, but I would use, it's almost a place of safety. In that if I have come out of the sacred and I'm walking through the threshold or the betwixt and the between and then re-entering the mundane, it's that place where I'm able to clear away from me or be, let go of me those things which have followed me from the spirit world. So I think that the betwixt and the between is an important aspect of us. I think that if we stand in the betwixt and the between, it helps me to understand or to explore what frightens me in the world around me. If I'm standing in that betwixt and that between place, then I also have the ability to look around the spirit world from that glass window, so to speak. That's not my vision, but if I have to give you a vision, I'd say that. So I'm in this glass enclosed room, and on one side of the room is the spirit world, and I walk the length of the room, however much room that is, and I look to the other side, and the other side is the mundane world. So it's in this betwixt and the between place where I also like to sort my thoughts, and where I also like to try to make sense of what I've experienced in the spirit world before I bring it back into the physical world. So I'm attempting to maintain the unconscious, my connection to the unconscious, in order to bring it into the conscious. So the betwixt and the between is that place of the unknown. It is that liminal place, that place between, that place where things are. And we are bounded by wilderness. We have peaks, we have very hostile deserts, we have things that are safe and things that are unfamiliar. So the betwixt and the between surrounds us all of the time. In our natural world, we have been brought up to have a relationship, positive or negative, to the world around us. When we are walking over the boundary, we are crossing into the divine, into the sacred. So we're coming from the controlled into the uncontrolled. So again, this is just a very thin place. So the laws of society hold no sway here. And I like to use the term amoral. Oftentimes when we speak about beings that we encounter in the spirit world, I think we tend to anthropomorphize far too much. I think in that anthropomorphizing spirit, we are not allowing that spirit to have a relationship for itself, unto itself, and within the world of itself. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the the world here in this space is of its own choosing, and we have a set of moral codes, we have a set of way of doing things, we have a certain proclivity for XYZ. The relationship of the spirits to us and our proclivity to anthropomorphize or to place upon something that is not human becomes a problem. The encounters that I have had is that the spirits are neither moral nor immoral. They are merely amoral. When we work with beings who do not treat us as we believe we should be treated, as we are amazing human beings, we take that overculture view with us when we enter into an unknown place. I'm not saying you individually. I think you is a collective term. I don't know how you individually perceive the spirit world or not. However, I am fully aware that the overculture, the society we live in, has placed upon us certain limitations and certain views of how the spirit world should act, react, and respond. If a particular spirit didn't treat you very nicely, not like you would want to be treated, I think that instead of implying or applying human morals, mores, values, etc., we could apply that the spirit in and of itself has its own rules, its own laws, and is subject to those. Now, I've gone a little bit beyond the betwixt and the between, and for that I do apologize. I'm going to bring it back just a little bit. I think from the place of the betwixt and the between, we have created many monsters in our myths and in our stories, which I find really very kind of part of who we are. I think that the wilderness is a mirror to our own savage interior. And it is that savage interior is controlled by civilization. And humans who live in the wild would be of wild or would be wild-like. So when we talk about you moving from this world and going into the spirit world in 1 day and 3 days, and the changes and the losses and so on and so forth, I think this is also speaking to that when we talk about the wilderness, and when we think about some of the versions of Red Riding Hood have been changed. Even the Brothers Grimm changed the stories themselves, because the stories themselves became their obsessions, and they did 7 editions of the Grimm's fairy tales. So they did change certain things. In some stories, the wolf is considered to be the masculine. And of course, then how do we see Red Riding Hood? We see Red Riding Hood as the feminine or the innocence. And that innocence has been moved through the woods. That innocence is going into the wildness. And that innocence is being stalked, preyed upon, predatored by the wildness, by the wolf-like, by the creature, by the masculine, by that wolf-like being. And in some versions of the story, the huntsman saves them. In some versions of the story, Red Riding Hood willingly goes into bed with the wolf, knowing that it is the wolf and not the grandmother. So here we have even different versions of the wilderness. We have a caring human being, a woodsman, a person who is of the woods, who is known to frequent the place of the unknown, coming in to rescue the feminine, the innocence, the young girl, the crone. And then we have the other extreme of the young child giving herself, her womanhood, her innocence over to the masculine, the wild-like. So don't sacrifice your innocence to the wolf-like being, to the wildness being. And each story has its own connotations. From a feminist perspective, the giving over of the innocence to the wolf-like creature, I find abhorrent. However, I also do recognize that over time, we as society have changed our view of who human beings are. They're matter, they're not collateral, they are not, etc., etc., etc. So we understand that our stories have changed, and we understand that stories change in order to represent or to reconcile the changes within culture and within society. So the ability of the other world, so when we come into the other world, cross between the betwixt and the between, and I've talked a little bit about that, the other world is paralleled or on the other side of that maple leaf. And as a result of that, the laws, the inhabitants, and the power structure is something that is always there. It doesn't go away. So located in the outside, in the beyond, in the wild, which is both here and both somewhere else, it has its own laws. The spirit world has its own inhabitants. It has its own power structure, etc., etc. You've heard me say a number of times that the spirit world is not dependent on us, but is rather independent of us. So the relationship of the dependent and the independent, the relationship between that which is wanted versus that which is a necessity, also is something that I wanted to touch on. So in this elusive realm, so in the fairy is an elusive realm, the caves can be elusive realms in stories, as also as in journeys. The underwater is that elusive realm, and the dream is also those elusive realms. Those are all places of the betwixt and the between. And those encounters, not always, so in our stories, that when we go into the elusive realm of the fairy, the cave, the underworld, the dream, not all of us have a happy outcome. Not all stories have a happy outcome. Not all journeys have a happy outcome. Not all seeking to find answers have answers that we're happy with or want to have an outcome with. When we return, again, that world has changed. I referenced a few podcasts ago with regard to Hansel and Gretel leaving the stones or the bread on the pathway in order to find their way out, and that they could never find their way out again, because when you go in, you can never come out the same way again. So you can't use the same path again. Here we cannot use the same path again. If we go into the cave, we cannot come out again, because we've touched that elusive realm. We've touched that realm of the betwixt and the between. We've moved into that spirit world, that other world. And this creates transformation for us. This creates an openness, a mysteriousness, an unpredictability to us. What is just below the surface of us? Oceans. I've talked about that relationship in water between that liminal place, that betwixt and the between, where we have air and underneath immediately we have no air. So that space between air and no air is that betwixt and the between. How do we see this betwixt and the between? So really, I've talked about this. So what am I trying to say about this? What I'm really trying to say about this is, if we have the time, the desire, the interest, I think interest is probably the biggest part, to take a look at some of the stories that are surrounding you. And if you are a Canadian or an American, what is your ancestral root? And can you find the stories from your ancestral root? Even though you may be, some of us refer to ourselves as a Hind 57 or a Mutt, or, whatever the case is. Do you can you have a story? And by looking through stories, we can begin to understand how our ancestors, our grandmothers, our mothers, how they responded, referred to, related to, and interacted, as well as integrated their relationship with the world around them. As the majority of us now live in urban zones, we now have the relationship of sequester. So the relationship where if you are a farmer or if you do not happen to live within an urban realm, you still have the experience of freedom of space or bigness of space, instead of the feeling of sequestered or the feeling of choice isolation. On the farm, I had isolation, but oftentimes it was chosen isolation. And it's also isolation because you're away from people, and it could be miles between you and your neighbor. Mind you, when you live in the country, miles aren't really a whole lot of things. It's when you get into the hundreds of miles, you think, oh, that's a really long trip. The betwixt and the between is a place I'd like you to explore and look at it differently. So that wilderness, that betwixt and the between, comes in the form of the forests. It comes in the form of the kraken, the beast that lives below the sea that could tear down a boat and bring you to the shores. It could be the sirens that lure you. It could be a cave that is in the story. It could be, what lives in caves. And how many of us are afraid to cave, or how many of us are afraid to go into the absolute dark and darkness, into that betwixt and the between, where we have no light and yet we are still able to have all of our other senses. It's that betwixt and the between. Comparing stories, comparing your own journeys, understanding in your journey what is or is not, or what can or cannot be, is really your own story. I know that there are things my journey people, my circle mates, my friends can do that I cannot do in my journeys, or I haven't been able to do. A friend of mine has a particular easy method of clearing one of her really important stones, where when I have to go clean my stone, which is a mirror to hers, I have to do a much more elaborate process. So I don't always have, my transformations may be more challenging for me than for you, and some of your transformations might be more challenging for you than for me. The betwixt and the between, it's important to recognize that there is that space where you are in that liminal space, where 1 minute you really are in the room and the next minute you're so not in the room. 1 minute you are conscious of your own movements, and the next minute you are conscious of your movements and aware that something is moving beside you that is not linked to you at all and has absolutely no desire to follow your lead, your will, your want, or your speed, for that matter. Understanding when you're in the liminal place, understanding when you're in the transitional place, really opens up your ability to change your perceptions and your awareness of the world around you. It's important to be aware, from my perspective. It's important to be aware of the betwixt and the between. It's important to be aware of where you've been, how you got there, how you're getting back. It's important for me to be aware of how am I affected in my body when I come out of my journey. How am I affected in my body? Am I affected in my body? Have I completely disassociated from my body and engaged only my spirit mind? Is my physical body experiencing stress, trauma, or bruising in the physical world? Is it come too close to me in the betwixt and the between? These are some of the things I haven't figured out, but these are some of the things that have certainly occurred to me while in the spirit world. I think it is incumbent upon us to be aware. I think it is incumbent upon us to be open enough to know when something is being suggested for us to us. I think it is important to know how powerful you are in the spirit world. I think it's important to know how strong you are in the spirit world. And I also think it's important to understand that you are still vulnerable in the spirit world. Even if you've crossed that betwixt and the between, you still have a human body on the other side of the betwixt and the between. There are reasons why the wilderness can be dangerous. There are reasons why the spirits take you under the water and drown you. There are reasons why our ancestors put these things in place. They put these things in place because people got lost and died in the wilderness all the time. Because we went such short places from our home to town, and even to go into town for our ancestors was a huge journey, because they were leaving the unknown for the unknown. They were leaving the challenge of the now into the challenge of, oh my gosh, what's coming up for us. Practice your diligence. Practice your eyes open. Practice your ears open. Practice body awareness. The Betwixt and the Between is an interesting place to go. There are many references to it. Some of them want you to be superstitious and afraid, and some of them want you to be lulled and welcomed in. In the words of Thoreau, "How can I fear the forest? For she is my mother. And how can I be afraid of my mother?" Until next time, I bid you a fond farewell.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.